So we're going to start off with kind of showing the setup in IBM Watson of how you, from the front end perspective, defines the intents, the entities, and kind of describe a little bit differences for those who are familiar with Watson around a dialogue. So the dialogue is really going to be more the workflow, but I wanted to introduce kind of what Watson gives you today out of the box and really how we work in partnership with Watson as well as a chatbot. The chatbot that we're going to use as a front end for the technical demo will be our Slack bot that we've done on previous webinars, and it's built out of the box with the Ayehu NG platform as well. So upfront, when as a user of IBM Watson, you have to create a workspace, and then within that workspace, you then define the specific categories for your intents, your entities, and then the dialogue. So you can see here today, what we have set up is a single workspace. In that workspace, we've defined some initial parameters for intent and entities. So our intents that we're working with today are going to be resolving around the password resets for Active Directory, application password resets, and statuses of tickets. Our entities that we have grouped at the moment are just application instance number, and I'll tie them into how we interact with them bidirectionally within the workflow designer. Um, those who are again familiar with Watson, the content catalog and a dialogue are actually not built into the platform because the workflow is really what creates the dialogue for you. Because up front, Watson is really more of a question answer. It doesn't have the ability to execute an action like resetting a password, going onto a server, deploying a new virtual machine, creating a ticket in some third-party system. So you do have to have a lot of additional components added on. And when you add those components on into Watson, you have to have a strong development team because everyone's components are flexible in the fact that Watson gives you an API, but as a user of that system, I have to be very tech savvy to be able to develop the code that allows me to create intents, manage intents, pull data from entities. So all that is very complex. So way we've broken it down and really our approach for all integrations and third parties within our platform is about simplicity. So let's jump into Ayehu NG. I'm kind of going directly. I'm not going to go into a huge overview of our product, but at the very general level, the main part around the orchestration is the workflow design. So right now, what I have on our screen is our workflow designer in our next generation platform. On the left-hand side, we list out all of our pre-built activities. These are the building blocks that I can use in my workflow designer. I have a couple different options of how I add them today. You can do the typical approach of left-clicking, finding my activity, left-clicking, dragging into my workflow designer, placing it at specific points that are currently available in the design. I can also use a direct search now. So if I come into the link, I can also do a search here as well. So you can see it lists out the activities that I may want to add, and I simply left click and adds it to my current palette. Now, tying into the Watson and the Slack, but specifically starting with Watson, how do I set up a Watson integration? How do I actually pull intent? And what other functions can I get with that? Right. Today, what we've pre-built is two individual activities. So we have an activity for learning and an activity for search. If I'm using the search activity, which I already have one here set up, I'm just really following a wizard. So from a perspective of setting up and leveraging the Watson system for being able to use the natural language processing, be able to match them with intents and entities, it's all done through the UI. There is absolutely zero coding that I have to do. Once you set up the system, the activities it will be available to you, and really all you have to do is include the inputs or the parameters that we're expecting to be able to execute. So from this view here, the inputs that I need for the searching capability is to define which system, because you could technically have multiple workspaces. So I'll define the Watson assistant. The phrase will be the incoming phrase that I should be evaluating. Right now, you can see we've made a dynamic reference using our system to pull the output from a prior step called request. So the request from a chatbot perspective will be the unstructured text or the string that's entered into the chat, and that'll be included and passed over to Watson as the phrase. The next step for the configuration will be defining your criteria, essentially your threshold for what is going to define a match. So right in our demo environment where we have set up here, we're going to look for anything over a 70% score for matching a specific intent. What's returned is, do I want to return intent or entities? It's a simple dropdown. And then the next three parameters are customized to what your environment is. And that's it. Once I have those items entered into my activity, you're set up for that specific action within your workflow. So in this step, what I'm doing is doing a search for intents that have a score over 70, matching the phrase that was included into the chat that will be starting shortly. The second activity is involving learning. So it's great that I can do search, but how do I manage the intents? How do I add more content? And how do I have the Watson side learn based off of the interactions that customers are having with the chatbot in real time? So we've added a second activity called the learn function. So in the learn function has a very similar setup where I just enter in the appropriate inputs. The learning function is typically going to be added at the end of your workflow, confirming if the processes that we're taking are accurate. And if so, we want to be able to add that content back into for the next time someone asks a similar question, or next time someone has a specific intent that matches and maybe it hasn't matched the first time it went through, but it will match for the next time it goes through. So the learning function allows us to now pass data back into Watson and add additional strings into the intent. So how is that done? I enter in the phrase, which intent I want to add it to, and you can see again it's dynamically referenced because obviously throughout the process of the conversation that we're having in the workflow, I may be referencing one intent versus another, so it's dynamically set. And then the last three parameters are the more static parameters of which environment in Watson I'm going to be connected to, and that's it. So let's go through and walk through a scenario here. So let me bring up our Slack chatbot and start through a couple different scenarios. So I'm going to walk through about 3 or 4 different areas in the chatbot and kind of show you where does Watson fit in and how Watson is interacting within the workflow. So up front, let's just start and trigger the conversation. So I'll just send a quick hello. And our standard function with Slack, we have an out-of-box integration with Slack. So what we're going to do is process the initial conversation. So up front, we're going to give you some buttons around what type of request you're asking for. So let's take the standard typical password reset. So if I'm asking for a password reset, it's already interacting with a workflow. So I actually have a workflow executed and it's going through the different decision trees, similar to kind of a dialogue that you can configure in Watson. But here it's a little more meaningful because it will get down to actually executing actions depending on what I'm requesting. So up front, let's say I want to reset my Active Directory password. It's going to ask for some two-factor authentication. So I'll enter my last 4 digits of my social security number. And then it will go ahead and now process the action. So this is really the power of what the Ayehu NG platform can be. It's great that I can interact because you can do that in really any platform. Ideally, in our platform, you're doing it through the UI, so there's zero coding necessary. But the actions that it executes on the system are all going to be handled in our instance of the Ayehu NG platform. So what it's gone is gone ahead and reset my AD password. It's given me a temporary password, and it's also gone ahead and created a ServiceNow ticket. In that process from step 1 to the finishing goodbye, actually Watson wasn't involved in that scenario. So now how do I interact with Watson to be able to determine what's the intent of my request? So let's take an example here. So let's start it again. Hello? And we're not going to choose a button. So we're going to freely describe what we're looking for. So let's say we want to look for the status of a ticket. So I'm going to say, what's the status of my ticket? So at this point, we're actually using the Watson search function. So in the workflow, as it steps through, it's now executing the call to Watson to look for my intent. So my intent has been matched to the ticket status intent. Now it's going to ask me for a ticket number. So let's go ahead and copy the ticket number that I was generated earlier for my password reset. I want to find out what happened to that ticket. I'm assuming it's closed, but let's confirm it. So I'm going to enter my ticket number. Now it's doing you leveraging our out-of-box integration with ServiceNow and doing a lookup. So it's gone ahead and confirmed that it was resolved and it was assigned to the LDAP group. And again, all the details from ServiceNow are accessible to you in our out-of-box integration with ServiceNow. But at the last step is the learning function. So we may not have that string or that sentence of a user that initiated this request, but I want to add that to my Watson logic. So if I hit yes, what we're going to see when we jump back into Watson is the phrase that we just entered added to my intents. So let's jump back to Watson and let's go back to the intents and ticket status. And there's my recent example or my recent phrase. So are the phrases. So as that life cycle of people using the system, the ability to add learning to the Watson intents is all done through a single activity. Now, going to the next scenario is how do we then leverage intents? We haven't done anything with intent yet. So for an intent for our scenario, let's say we do the similar step, but let's just try to bypass some of those steps. So I know my ticket number up front. Why do I have to ask for a ticket, then ask for it to prompt a next question of a follow-up of what ticket I'm looking for? I can actually bypass all that by leveraging the ability of entities. So let's go to the next scenario. So hello. Again, I'm not going to use any of the passwords, but this time I'm going to say, give me the status of ticket, and I'm going to paste in my ticket number. So what we have defined in Watson is a entity for ticket number. So it's going to know that INC is going to be some ticket. So up front, it knows my intent. It knows the entity of the ticket number. So it's not going to go through this similar scenario where I just went through, where it's going to ask me for the ticket number. It's already bypassed all that for me. So in this scenario, it's leveraged both entity intents all in one workflow. And that's the workflow I have in the background, which I'll just jump to very, very shortly next. Okay, so we're going to close it out. So let's go back into the workflow and kind of see the process of how this happens. So up front, here's the workflow. So this workflow actually is the master workflow for handling all three of those types of requests. The workflow designer allows a very simple way for me to customize my conversation as I go downstream. So if those who are familiar with Watson, the dialogue concept of kind of going through a system tree of questions and answers, it's very similar of that logic in the workflow designer as well, where I can build a conditional branches or a conditional tree as I step through. So at this step here in my conversation, I was doing a search for the entities, if you remember. If I find a search here with my condition, it contains no intent. That means I didn't match any of the intents for the 70%. It would go down this branch. Otherwise, it would go down this branch, which is our default. So here's where I then pull the intent name. So I'm querying the results from the Watson search. I'm now pulling the specific intent because we have found an intent. After I find the intent, I then want to look up the entities that match. So here's where I did the search for the entities. And then I went through and executed my workflow and then processed the response. So this workflow then executes my child workflow, which was the password reset, the ticket status, or really any workflow that I want to associate as a child process. But here's the power of what it executes. I'm saying I understand the intent now. I want you to execute this sub process. This one's the workflow, and the last step was the learning. So all that done through the UI. There is absolutely no coding that's necessary to build this. It's actually all done through the browser and in the designer. One additional item for those who are not familiar with the NG platform, we actually also log and audit every action taken. So if I wanted to go back historically and kind of see kind of the steps, how many times they were executed, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. But up front, we have a single view for that. So what we have is what we call the audit trail. So the audit trail lists out all the interactions of the workflows and the output. So you can see here, and the bottom screen here is the conversation I just had previously. So the previous one where I used intent. So you can see where the phrase of status of ticket number was included as my response, which is then uploaded into Watson. And when Watson executed its search, so this is the out-of-box Watson search capabilities, but what output it returned. So the output it returned was that the intent with ticket status, and it was a score of about 72.3%. So we know it's a very high match. And again, over my threshold of 70, so it executed my action. Then it did a search for the entities. So we knew the entity of the incident number, because we already had it pre-configured, was also returned. So we know that this was a true entity. So we matched it back into our workflow. And that gives us the very simple and seamless way for us to interact bidirectionally with Watson using one or at most two activities, depending on my specific scenario at that point. Okay, so that ends the technical portion of the demo.